Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's Wednesday lunch here at the Divinity School. I'm Karen Wine, the Director of Communications. I organized this series, so it's wonderful to see so many of you come out today. Before we get started on the program, I want to do our usual housekeeping. Our chef for today is Casey, who I'm not sure, is she back here? She's back here. So along with our crew, made this meal from scratch today. So we do ask that you clean up after yourselves. As always, your compost and plates are compostable. And do that as you go out in your trash and your mug there's going to be a big tray there and your silverware and the soapy mat. That helps us out a lot if you clean out as you go. Are there any community announcements today?
Indeed. Hi everyone. Our final craft of teaching session of this quarter will be just after Thanksgiving on Tuesday, December 1st at noon in the Marty Center. We have our philosophy of teaching statement workshop. Philosophy of teaching statements being a document you will need on the job market and is also a capstone requirement for the craft of teaching certification. Bill Rando from the Chicago Center of Teaching will lead our workshop on this, and it should be a good deal of fun. And pretty important as well, so hope to see you there.
Okay, I'll just let you know there is creamer and hot water for tea, and also tea in the back if you're looking for that. Next week is our last Wednesday lunch of the quarter. It's going to be a no-speaker lunch. We're calling it Friendsgiving. It's going to be nice, relaxed lunch with some games and good conversation, so please join us for that. We'll start again after the break on January 7th, so look for our schedule online or see me if you have questions. I also want to remind you to please turn off your ringers. And now I'm going to introduce our dean. This is a special Dean's Forum lunch where we have faculty members discussing the work, so please join me in welcoming Dean Rosengarten, who will introduce the speakers.
Thank you for that welcome. We should do that more often. I want to invite our panel up to take seats now. If I'm not mistaken, and that's a famous conditional with me, as you know, because it probably means that I am, this is actually the 15th year that we've done this. And the Dean's Forums were started as an opportunity to do two things. One is to highlight recent publications of faculty, and secondly, to create a kind of conversation that honors, on the one hand, depth of scholarly investigation, and on the other hand, conversation across the very disciplines themselves that measure depth. So what we try to do is we pick recent publications and then faculty from other areas of study who read the book and comment on it. And that's meant to model a certain kind of conversation that is, we hope, essential to the life of the school. So it's a real pleasure and an honor to notate the fact that we're beginning our celebration of the 50th anniversary with this particular one today. Professor Jeffrey Stackert, Associate Professor of Hebrew Bible, has written a fascinating book called A Prophet Like Moses. Professors Willemien, Schweiker, and Willemien Otten have very graciously agreed to offer responses. The format is that Professors Otten and Schweiker will first deliver their remarks, and then Professor Stackert gets the podium and can set the record straight. I mean that in the very best sense, of course. I want to emphasize that I haven't said to the respondents, you're responsible for summarizing everything in the book. They may or may not, they're totally at liberty. But the idea really is to create a conversation around the claims in the book that brings together some sense of what Professor Stackert has accomplished with kinds of questions one would bring, in this case, from history, Christianity, theology, theological ethics, and the like. So I want to say welcome to all three of you. I want to say thanks to all three of you, especially Professor Stackert for his willingness to do this. And I want to get out of the way so we can have some fun. So welcome. And Professor Otten will go first, and then Professor Schweiker.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry I didn't quite time this, so I've gone too long.
Yeah, right.
Try me. went into theology, which was the Dutch and European umbrella term for the study of religion, to be sharply distinguished from anything like the theology area in this school, a point to which I will come back. My goal was actually to study the Old Testament, which was our term for what in the US is called Hebrew Bible. As my staunchly reformed mother-in-law used to put it, Jesus is for wimps. Because I love the stories about the prophets and kings of the Old Testament much better. Saul was my tragic hero. David was also not bad, but problematic in his dealings with women. Someone whose wisdom was, of course, unsurpassable, and who did not relish Amos' tirade to the cows of Bethel. For our first year Hebrew exam, we had to do an oral examination on 40 chapters, preparation for which kept you pretty much busy that first year as you were learning the language, but also doing a substantive introduction to the history of philosophy. At the end of their first year, students would pass their so-called propedeutic exam, and it's only then that we were deemed ready to start a course of studies in theology proper, by which I then refer to the umbrella term. When I tried to reconstruct the other day what I actually read for my 40 chapters, which one was free to select, I remember there being a lot of Genesis, in addition to Amos, the Song of Songs, maybe Jonah, but the major prophets Jeremiah, Isaiah, or Ezekiel were noticeably absent. I guess the center of gravity had moved to the Torah for me, which I've been brought up to see as the heart of the Old Testament, that part that counted most of all. Although I should qualify that I never understood it to mean law, but always teaching, so I never encountered the typical Lutheran bias that sets up law versus grace, or law versus prophecy. In a prophet like Moses, our colleague Jeffrey Stackert gives us a robust account of the difficulty with which Moses has been received in critical Old Testament scholarship, being forced into the role of lawgiver rather than prophet. And his book can be seen as an attempt to try and uncover and foreground that older layer of Mosaic interpretation. Using my own imagination, I think that he's so right to see Moses as prophet. The passing through the Red Sea, the killing of the Korachites, and the holding up of his arm in the fight against the Amalekites, Exodus 17, one of my favorite stories. This is not what a lawgiver, but what a prophet does. As an aside, the role of Moses was put to strange but effective rhetorical use in Bernard of Clairvaux, who got himself talked into preaching the Second Crusade, a decision he later surely regretted. Although this crusade was a significant failure and Bernard henceforth wisely stayed out of such politics, he nevertheless did not want to admit to any defeat, and to that end cites the role of a failing Moses, who led the people out of Egypt to promise them a better country, but actually never brought them there. He did everything God commanded, according to Bernard, but they were an obdurate people, like the failed crusaders. Here you taste something of how the medievals could see Moses as a prophet as fair deity or man of God, whose memory was kept alive across the centuries. But the position of Moses in Hebrew Bible scholarship has been much more complex, and Professor Stackert does a good job of introducing us to its complexity. This complexity entails a reconsideration of the so-called documentary hypothesis, now known as the neo-documentary hypothesis. This exercise in source criticism and Near Eastern history, I should now confess, is what ultimately made me decide not to go into the field, as I was always more taken by the literary aspect of the Old Testament than by any archaeological or philological excavations. Although to this day I regret having in consequence given up the language as well. In contrast, Professor Stackert is simply magisterial at his job, and in a clear, even if difficult narrative, leads us through the Wellhausen hypothesis and its aftermath. His reflection focused first on prophecy, law, and Israelite religion after Wellhausen, next on the literary portrayal of Mosaic prophecy in the Torah sources, followed by the Elohist source, the end of Israelite prophecy, the Deuteronomic source, prophecies, anemic future, and finally the priestly and Yahwistic sources, separating prophecy and law. Clearly, as if there could be any doubt, the chapter headings I just mentioned take us on a tour d'horizon of all the fine points of the documentary and neo-documentary hypothesis. They first lead me to make the following observations about Professor Stackert's approach and insights, after which I will have some criticism as well. While I have no personal investment in whether or not one buys into the documentary hypothesis, it would seem to me after reading Professor Stackert's book that if and when you do, accepting his refinement of it according to the so-called new documentary hypothesis makes a lot of sense. I simply lack the expertise to quibble on smaller points, and am both impressed and persuaded by the master, whom I can only follow. But that being said, let me nevertheless try to make some comments. My main point would be that while it is useful to give us insight into the analytical and historical parsing of the sources that constitute the Hebrew Bible, or the Torah, it's my personal opinion as a scholar, regardless of any particular field, that one should not only unravel and put asunder, but also put back together again. In other words, since what I imagine to be true for the scholar who goes into any field, there's a certain attraction to that field. And here I should add that I personally see divinity, to use our US umbrella term, closer perhaps to the humanities than to the social sciences. There's an aesthetic fascination with what it is that makes people read these texts, beyond the mere fact that they are the sanctioned sources of both Judaism and Christianity. My question about the neo-documentary hypothesis then, I guess, and I should specify that it's more a question than a problem, is what at the end of the day it adds to our reading of the Torah, especially in light of the distinction between the traditional Jewish compartmentalization of Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. And actually my question is, do you want to question that compartmentalization as well? Thanks to Professor Stackert's book, I'm actually in a position towards halfway answering this question myself. For if I see it correctly, it allows him to uncover indeed the role of Moses as prophet, a role that had been buried under the focus on law-giving that had become traditional since Wellhausen. So in fact, there's a partial answer to my question as to the topic of this book. But the larger question still puzzles me, and I hope Professor Stackert can address it, namely why this, dare I say it, almost religious focus on the neo-documentary hypothesis as the best way to study the Pentateuch. I would invite Professor Stackert to elaborate on why he thinks this is indeed the case, what he sees as wrong when you do not hold that position, and what he thinks the differences between those scholars who do and those who don't, such that he feels that those who do accept the neo-documentary hypothesis have the edge. I ask this in part out of curiosity, because I do not particularly feel tied to any method myself in studying my own corpus of text, putting the love of the corpus from my aesthetic perspective above any historical methods used to study it. But of course, I have my own biases, of which I'm only too aware, such as that I want to widen the canon of which texts define what we consider medieval thought. So not just Augustine, Aquinas, and a few others. I'm curious then as to what the added value is of the neo-documentary hypothesis, that it should be the preferred method of studying the Torah. I see as one direct payoff the rehabilitation of Moses as prophet, as I just said, and the lifting of the all too facile contrast between law and prophecy. But, to throw a curveball, was that in its sharpest formulation not always a particular Lutheran problem to begin with, referring back to the idea that I never grew up with the notion of Torah as law and Moses as its lawgiver? To follow up on this, I want to make a minor, but for me important point about how Professor Stackert deals with prophets and prophecy. Clearly, for him, the norm is that of Near Eastern studies, in which prophecy is a form of divination, page 40. But without claiming exceptionalism, I wonder whether there's not more flexibility to see the biblical prophet in a different light, To give another example, when Peter Brown wrote his seminal article about the rise and function of the holy man in late antiquity, which he wrote in 1971, he might have seen the holy man also as a diviner of sorts. And yet, he went to a different route, giving us a much more textured notion of ancient Christian saints, leaving them fully Christian, and yet also inserting them fully in the landscape of late antiquity. In other words, thus taking the regime of Near Eastern studies as the norm, not unnecessarily limit the resonance of the prophets, including a prophet like Moses. And finally, I know Professor Stackert wants me to say something about the end of his book, and his plea for a positioning of biblical studies in the sphere of religious studies rather than theology or Near Eastern studies. He introduces his comments in the book by referencing Wellhausen's unhappiness at the theological faculty at Greifswald, feeling himself more a historian than a theologian. I actually have a small question on the side here, for in the citation Professor Stackert gives us, Wellhausen mentioned that the New Testament scholar Holtzmann does see more direct application of his work in theology, and I'm actually curious to find out what that application for Holtzmann would entail. Hopefully, Professor Stackert can enlighten me more about this. But back to the question of religious studies versus theology or Near Eastern studies, I'm not sure I served Professor Stackert well with my answer if I say that at the end of the day, I may not care that much as long as the scholarship is good. But the lack of care I voice here should be seen as qualified by my comments along the way that 1, I tend to see theology, even in the German sense, as an umbrella term, and 2, that I see the whole field of theology and religious studies as closest to the humanities, although I recognize that colleagues in anthropology, sociology, religion may not see it this way. That being said, maybe at this point I should stick out my neck in the way I know Professor Stackert hoped I would, by making the following statement. The study of theology as a normative field, under which I would then place the ministry program, and the field of religious studies are to me at risk of both becoming stepchildren of the academy, which is reason enough for me to say that I think they should remain connected, as they have the subject matter in common, and there's no point in marginalizing a minuscule area even further by stirring up internecine warfare in it. Like Jacob and Esau, theology and religious studies are joined at the hip. And I look forward at the Divinity School to what more their at times uncomfortable academic twinning may have in store for us.
Well, I want to begin with a word of gratitude to Dean Richard Rosengarten for the invitation to participate in this event, and also to Professor Willemien Otten for joining me in this forum on Professor Jeffrey Stackert's rich and exceedingly complex text. I also want to thank all of you for coming today, and most of all to Professor Stackert himself. Gratitude expressed, let me begin with the text. It will not just surprise you to learn that I did my training in theology, ethics, and biblical studies in the last millennium, specifically in the late 20th century. Now, aside from locating me in time and much closer to Moses than I would like to admit, that fact of my education is surprisingly important for our discussion today. Just as Professor Otten, I too cut my teeth on the documentary thesis. That is the thesis that the Pentateuch is composed of different literary sources with different Sitzenleben and also different theologies. So while my own scholarly focus is in theological ethics and not biblical studies, I find insightful and compelling Stackert's attempt to further what is called the neo-documentary thesis. It entails a careful consideration of literary layers or strata in the Bible, the famous J, E, P, and D, in order to illuminate ancient Israelite religion and to rejuvenate biblical studies. Bravo. I feel at home and in the new millennium. Now, rather than summarize this book, I want, due to limits of time, to explore Stackert's work in relation to the question about the place of Bible in Christian theology and ethics. But my real focus here is on how disciplines are defined and how knowledge is constituted. These are, I think, some of the most important points of agreement and possible disagreement between us. So first, it is important to note that in the 1970s and through the remainder of the last century, there is an explosion of work on the topic of the ethics in the Bible as distinct from the use of the Bible in ethical reflection. That work was driven in part by Vatican II and the thought, among other things, that one should rejuvenate the historical critical biblical studies among Catholic scholars and also to advance moral theology and its relation to Scripture. Of course, Protestants had always been concerned about the use of the Bible in ethical reflection, and they also helped usher in the kind of critical biblical scholarship we are exploring today in this Dean's Forum. Behind these motives of scholarship lay the work of theologians who turned to Scripture in order to respond to the scourge of fascism and the devastation of World War II. Some of those thinkers, like Gerhard von Rad of Heidelberg, were interested in the, quote, theology of the Old Testament, something I think that would really disturb Mr. Stackert. Now, admittedly, Professor Stackert might be confused at this point. It could appear that I have utterly missed the fact that he wants to locate biblical studies outside of theology and within religious studies. But I agree that we do not want the literary and historical analysis of the biblical text to be skewed by contemporary religious concerns or by adherence to religious dogma. My point is that theology, at least non-ecclesiocentric academic theology, is not the bugaboo assumed by this text. Theology, especially as it's practiced here in Chicago, takes as its first task, as Paul Tillich once put it, the criticism of religion. That is one reason that theologians interested in ethics and politics, theologians like me, do not want to confuse the use of the Bible in ethics with the ethics in the Bible, even if they're interested at points of intersection. The former is the critical and constructive task carried out by theological ethicists that has its own conceptual, methodological, and criteriological demands. The latter is a historical and literary work done by historians and biblical scholars. Yet that being said, insofar as Stackert understands the Pentateuch sources as, quote, historicized political analogies, unquote, it would seem that he might have more in common with non-ecclesiastical theological reflection than he might imagine. In fact, could one see the Elohist precisely as a criticism of prophetic religion in the name of law, even as D and P also mark their own criticisms and reconstruction? In other words, is the neo-documentary thesis itself a way to show critical thinking within the texts themselves? Another distinction is needed, namely between what motivates scholarship and what determines or defines the object of study. As far as I can tell, historical and literary inquiry is rarely, if ever, self-motivating. They are driven, like all forms of human thinking, by the concerns, questions, and worries of thinkers and disciplines. The problem must be, then, when motive distorts or defines the object and purpose of inquiry. But to assume that contemporary motivation to study the Bible necessarily, rather than contingently, determines the object of study seems, at least to me, unwarranted and certainly in need of considerable defense. Now, so far I've drawn some distinctions between the use of the Bible in ethics and the ethics in the Bible, between non-confessional theology that entails the criticism of religion and ecclesiocentric kinds of theology, and between the motivation of thinking and the object and purpose of inquiry. I've done so in order to nuance the question about the relationship between the discipline of theology and biblical studies that, in his critique of Wellhausen, frames this book. And this brings us to the heart of Stackert's text, the relation of law and prophecy in Israelite religion. Let's get some clarity on basic concepts. Stackert defines religion by following the work of our former and now sadly lost colleague, Martin Riesebrod. That is, religion, on that account, is about establishing contact with and access to superhuman powers in order to confront the challenges of human life. Law and prophecy, we might say then, are two different religious forms, maybe even two different religions. The book aims to show, through the figure of Moses, that different literary strata accept or reject the mix of prophecy and laws as ways of connecting to divine power. Stackert charts an anti-prophetic, pro-legal understanding of proper religion in yellowest, the accommodation of prophecy within a legal framework that thereby truncates prophecy's future, D, Deuteronomist, the separating of prophecy and law within priestly cultic framework of access to divine power, the priestly source, or oddly enough, referring little to prophecy or law at all, as in the Yahuwah's, the J-source. Stackert's work illuminates and explains the import of the documentary hypothesis in ways that are penetrating of ancient religion and forms of literary argument for defining religion. Interestingly enough, the discourse of law and prophecy are deep within Western Christian and Jewish ethical reflection, Eastern as well, and importantly have been conceptual points where different sources of thought, the Bible, Roman law, Greek philosophy, even the mystery religions, intersect and are rendered productive in moral and political thought. Theologians, despite the biblical scholars' worry, have never been blind to the fact that they have actually worked to render productive rather than destructive these intersections around basic concepts between seemingly incommensurable forms of thought. They were engaged in the cross-tradition, criticism, and reconstruction of religious ways of life. In other words, ideas about religion, law, and prophecy have not only demarcated distinct domains of social and personal life, they have also constituted complex intersections or webs of reflection on the complexity and orientation of human, personal, and social life. Now, it is crucial to note here that the focus on the prophets over and against law is precisely what Stackert, on my reading, is battling. He would, I suppose, see the discussion among theologians about the prophet as the fateful and troubling legacy of Wellhausen and his companions in developing the documentary thesis. Still, insofar as Stackert is interested in political critique within the textual sources, there is again an analogy to the kind of cross-tradition criticism and reconstruction of religion I just noted. Of course, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see mistakes in detail and also the ways that convictions that inform theological and ethical thinking did, in fact, distort the critical study of the Bible. Fair enough. Nevertheless, the ongoing struggle to articulate the method and criteria for the use of the Bible in ethics was crucial for many reasons. Let me note two. First, the use of the Bible in ethics set the question of the connection between religion and history, and therefore this whole social, cultural, political, economic, and legal doings of human beings. It placed that at the center of reflection. And that fact means that one could not appeal to non-historical sources of authority, even as one must try to justify norms and values within the torrent and flux of time. Second, the critical study of the Bible forced the question within theology and ethics of whether or not there was something distinctive at all or unique about the worldview of the biblical text in regard to social and political matters. That opened theological and ethical reflection to an engagement with the wild diversity of moral outlooks and orientation among the world's peoples. In other words, isolating the conceptual intersection among forms of thought through law, prophecy, and religion has allowed theology and biblical studies to provide context for the intersection of disciplines. I'm going to exploit this last point about the intersection of disciplines by showing how, ironically, some attention to the history of theology and moral philosophy might actually strengthen Stackert's criticism of Wellhausen. Now, in his swipes at theology, swipes that I think are a virtual moral imperative among some biblical scholars, I have tried to show both conceptually and in terms of the history of thought that matters are simply more complex. Stackert's argument, it seems, would actually be enriched by noting the connections between the documentary hypothesis and 19th and early 20th century arguments in theology and ethics. How so? Well, Wellhausen's argument about law and prophecy, first published in 1878 and richly documented in this fabulous text, can be seen, and I think must be seen, within the post-Kantian debate about the relation between religion and ethics. Many 19th century Jewish and Christian thinkers sought to develop the idea of ethical monotheism in relation to prophetic ideas about justice, while others, say Friedrich Schleiermacher and Rudolf Otto and their ilk, sought to define religion independent of metaphysics or morals. Each of these were, in different ways, criticisms and reconstructions of ideas about religion. What Stackert's work suggests in this context is that these philosophical and theological thinkers and their lines of argument represent decidedly problematic accounts of law, prophecy, and religion vis-a-vis the Hebrew texts. But it is also the case that these debates are the intellectual context within which Wellhausen undertook his original project. Further, they might be seen on analogy to the debates among the textual sources that Stackert so carefully explores. Again, could one see the neo-documentary thesis itself as an attempt to chart the criticisms and reconstructions of religion among the various sources of the Pentateuch, or what becomes the Pentateuch, which only become visible once we grasp all the sources in play at once? Now, whatever one's judgment about that question, my final point is that maybe the task is not to decide if critical biblical scholarship is theological or not, or to argue for its placement in religious studies rather than Near Eastern studies. The real question is how we conceive of disciplines of thought and the constitution of knowledge. Of course, this might be the point of biggest difference between us, although I'm not sure. That is to say, I've been seeking in these remarks the intersection of disciplines with their criteria, methods, and concepts, driven by the belief that knowledge is constituted through a polycontextual and multi-perspectival intersections among disciplines, rather than the property of one single conceptual scheme, one single discipline. And I'm suggesting that the neo-documentary thesis might just entail, and even require, such a revised conception of biblical studies and the knowledge that it helps to constitute. Maybe it's time for our disciplines to catch up with what we've already been doing all along. And if we did so, we might find new ways to articulate both the criticism and the reconstruction of religion in its ancient forms, but also in terms of present life as well. Thank you.
Well, let me add my thanks to all that have come before. Thank you all first for coming and for listening to these, I think, really cogent and interesting analyses of the book that I wrote. Thank you to Dean Rosengarten for the opportunity to take part in this Dean's Forum, and specifically to Professor Schweiker and Otten for their remarks. They've given me a long list of possible items to respond to, and I should just check. Do we want to leave time for questions? other than,
You are in control.
so I'll respond.
But we have to end at 1:15.
Okay, so I'll respond briefly and hopefully leave a few minutes for people if you want to ask anything else. I knew when I was writing this book that I was going to press certain buttons both within the field of biblical studies as it's normally constituted, and then outside of it too, because I was taking, I think, what has generously been called swipes at other subfields. What I would say about this is what you heard, I think, reflected in both the comments from Professors Otten and Schweiker, and that is that the book is really about looking at not only the primary texts and what those texts tell us about the religious imagination of ancient Israel, but also it's an attempt to look at the way that those texts have been understood in modernity, and specifically in particular Christian ways. And so I should maybe even illustrate this in the image on the front of the book, which you may not be able to see very well, but it's a Byzantine image, and it has, this is Moses in the burning bush, and Moses has this nimbus, this halo around his head. This looks like a really Christian image to me when I look at it. But there's a way in which the book is about the Christian Moses and its alternatives. And so I was first not very happy when the publisher wanted to use this image, but then I realized, oh, this is actually a good representation for what the book is doing. With that said, I think you heard both in Professor Schweiker's and Professor Otten's comments a kind of differentiation, an attempt to say theology isn't exactly what you say it is. And to that I agree. One of the difficulties within biblical studies is that theology, as it functions, I would say, within the field of biblical studies or in relation to the field of biblical studies, is most often something different than theology at the University of Chicago. So in writing, I had to think about my own context and also the context of my audience, and I chose to prioritize the latter, which is to say that I'm thinking more about theology outside of the University of Chicago, and it's the case that the joke about biblical scholars is that most of them are recovering fundamentalists. It's the case that there's a lot of conservative Christianity in biblical studies, and so there's a way in which I'm focused on a particular context. I should also say, in relation to this point, that we can make some distinctions geographically, right? So that when Professor Otten says theology as an umbrella term for something like religious studies in certain European contexts, I try to be careful about saying we're talking about a North American context where the terminology looks similar but actually has a different valence and nuance. On this point that both of our speakers have raised about this question of how to situate biblical studies in relation to theology, I think it's exactly the case that we need to think about situating biblical studies intellectually in an interdisciplinary context, like I think what you heard from Professor Schweiker in particular. And there's a way in which my argument for situating biblical studies in the context of religious studies or the humanities more broadly, to draw on some of what Professor Otten said as well, is to make a claim like this, that what we need is an interdisciplinary context, and that to me is fundamentally what religious studies is. It's an area study, of course, but it's an area study that encompasses a whole set of methods, a whole set of sub-areas of inquiry that we have to do a little bit of work, I would say, within our faculty to hold together. We have a kind of breadth that requires us to do some extra work sometimes to make sure that we understand what others are talking about, both methodologically and in terms of content or subject matter. I think it's the case, though, that situating biblical studies in the context of religious studies as an interdisciplinary venue for that work is important precisely because of, and this is part of the argument that I make in the book, because of the tradition of self-critique that happens within academic religious studies. There's a kind of reflexivity, there's a kind of internal critique that is happening all the time, precisely in relation to questions of contemporary religion. And so to think about, say, the documentary hypothesis in the context of the broader philosophical and theological traditions that were being developed in the late 19th and early 20th century, I think is exactly the right thing. And the distinction I guess I want to make is between doing that kind of history of research and then doing the kind of work on primary texts that I want to say is not entirely divorced from the former, but also has a slightly different trajectory itself. On the question of biblical studies in relation to religious studies and the threat of religious studies and ministerial studies as stepchildren in the academy, I think is an interesting argument. It's a kind of pragmatic argument that approaches the question from a different angle, but in a similar vein of pragmatism that my own argument traces. I think it's an interesting possibility that we would analyze the situation this way, and I guess I hold out more hope for religious studies in the context of the humanities than perhaps I fear that I hear in Professor Otten's comments. Maybe just a last thing to say before I stop and allow others to jump in. What does the documentary hypothesis add to our reading of the text? And so Professor Otten even suggested that I'm characterized by a kind of religious focus or religious devotion to the documentary hypothesis. Some of my students are smiling in the room, I can see, because they agree. What I think is the value of this approach is to take a text that on its surface is fundamentally incoherent, and it provides a way of reading it that makes sense. And so Professor Otten asked the question, what about when we put the pieces back together? And this is where I offend people. I think that the compiled text is unreadable. And that doesn't mean that a whole host of people have found ways of reading it. I've actually written about this too, how that happens and how I think that's possible. But when we treat the text like naturally occurring literature from its ancient context, what we see is that it's an ill fit literarily. And it just so happens that the way it was compiled allows us to reconstruct these earlier sources from which it was put together. And in the process, we move from a text that is unreadable to texts that are readable. So I'll stop here, and if there are other questions, I'm happy to.
We have about 5 minutes, or 6 or 7, if this wine doesn't hit me with a wet noodle. So please, Mr. Krantz.
This is a question, I guess, for everyone. I think it's interesting when we think about the disciplines that we set up, the different means of thinking about these questions, and also like differences between law and prophecy that both Professor Otten and Professor Schweiker started your talks with the autobiographical. And I was wondering if there's something in that looking at the autobiographical and where these sort of like divisive, perhaps disciplines or aren't as easily demarcated, which is helpful for thinking about this. And it could just be a side note that you guys really happen to start like that, but I found it interesting.
Well, I must admit I had to carve this down from a rather long paper. I found this book so intriguing. It may be autobiographical, but behind that, at least in my part, is also a kind of lament. That we have people coming in to study theology and ethics who know nothing about the Bible. And that to me is just really astonishing if we look at the history of theological and ethical reflection. Whatever one wants to make about the status of the text, right, or its coherence, I would say that part of its incoherence is what allows it to be a criticism of religion internally. That's the argument I was trying to make. But it's really amazing that at times, if I could be provocative a moment, it seems to be more important to know Michel Foucault than it is to know the New Testament. And I find that a little troubling myself.
Well, in my case, it's just really true. I mean, I was going to go into Old Testament until I thought, that was not really what I wanted to do. So that would not have happened with another author, say. But I do think, what I made another comment about, I do think some of these problems are not necessarily autobiographical, but are really shaped by tradition. Mm-hmm. So Wellhausen, with his own biases in a way that made him first go into theology, must have, and then wanting to move away. And I think on a larger scale, I'm interested in that too. Is it possible to have, say, a different reading of the Hebrew Bible between, say, Judaism and Christianity? I find that actually a very salient but difficult question. So I think the autobiographical, in my own sort of little case, has larger cultural implications in a way if you draw broader circles around it.
May I ask a question? I wanted to go back to one of your remarks, Professor Stackert, Jeff, and ask you to amplify on it a little bit. You characterize religious studies as a kind of area studies. And I think I get the force of that, but I want to hear you say a little more about it. And I'll, borrowing from Professor Schweiker, I'll be slightly provocative, but meant only in a way to urge you to talk, which is to say religion is not an area. So how do we think about, on your terms, religious studies? And if I could take it one step further, is there a place for the kind of theology that's been raised in different ways by your interlocutors and what you perceive of as religious studies?
Yeah. So I guess I could add greater specificity. Some of the ways that we organize knowledge in the university is focused on method. Some of those ways that we organize knowledge is focused on specific content or subject matter. We organize knowledge in sort of convenient ways for us as we think about it, recognizing that those boundaries are somewhat loose. In some universities, looser, and some less so. What I mean by thinking about religious studies as a kind of area study is to say that there's a way of focusing attention on a particular subject matter that allows for a kind of diversity within it, but there's something that is claimed as the center that holds for all who participate. And so we see other ways that that's defined in the university geographically. We see other ways it's defined in other ways, right? That the center is defined in these ways. And so what
I want to ask you about social thought.
Oh, okay. Yeah, social thought, I don't think it's just like global studies.
Right.
Right? That's everything. No, I think when we think about theology, say, as having a role in that, certainly I study theology in the sense that I am looking at the religious ideas of these ancient authors So I'm studying the theologies of these different sources. And so Professor Schweiker was focused on this in part of his comments. And absolutely, this is the case. The question is, and I think this is one of these moments where places like Chicago, there are some other instances where we might make similar claims in other universities, in the move towards contemporary constructive thought in theology. I see that as moving in a different direction. People call me naive for this, right? But I see that as moving, at least in important ways, in different directions than that kind of historical, descriptive, analytical work that I'm doing with these ancient texts. And so one of the I think, strong points of a curriculum or a faculty like ours is that we try to hold these tensions together, and we define ourselves as doing something both similar to and different from what's going on elsewhere. I don't want even my ideas about constructive studies or biblical studies to be sovereign in a situation like this. I want to push the dialogue. I want to say, okay, these are the potential problems that I have. These are the issues that I see. And how do you respond to that?
So in your religious studies world, there's definitely a place for the theology that's in the Bible.
I think so, yeah.
Is there a place for someone to do biblical theology?
For someone to do biblical theology.
To press it in a very specific way.
Yeah, so, I mean, as I'm defining my work as a biblical scholar, I'm trying to define it outside of confessional positions, right? And so I'm wondering, like, what does it mean to do biblical theology outside of a confessional context? It seems to me that, like, I can't think of a lot of examples of that. What this means is that I'm raising a kind of challenge to somebody defining themselves as an Episcopalian biblical scholar, or a Lutheran biblical scholar, or a Baptist biblical scholar, or a Jewish biblical scholar, right? I guess I don't want to rule out the possibility that somebody would do this. I can't think of examples of people doing this kind of work, and I think it points to some of what we've heard. There is a kind of hyper-specialization that's taken place within theology as traditionally understood, say, in a European context or in religious studies in the U.S., so that when I first arrived here, I would walk around sometimes with a Bible, and people would comment on this, like, "What are you doing carrying around a Bible?" As if that was somehow foreign to what was going on in the building. I said, "I'm a biblical scholar." But I think there is a kind of hyper-specialization that suggests to people that they should read Foucault and not the New Testament. Maybe I'm at fault even to some extent in this, which is to say, like, I offer mostly courses that require students to read texts in their original languages. But what about students who don't read those languages, right? So there is a kind of complicity that I might identify in myself. But with that said, I think we are in a kind of academic landscape that both looks like and also in important ways doesn't look like the University of Chicago Divinity School.
Other questions?
We're running out of time.
Are we running out of time? Oh, well, before we run completely out of time, let's please take a minute to thank all three of our speakers today. It's been wonderful.